So we pick up in Exodus after the Israelites have escaped Egypt. They've gone through the plagues and let my people go, and now they begin wandering. And they get to a place called Mount Sinai. And it's at Mount Sinai that God gives Moses, who's sort of their leader, the law. This is how you should live. This is what you should do. This is what you shouldn't do. And one of the first things they get is what we know as the Ten Commandments. Um, you've undoubtedly heard them before. Have no other gods before me. Don't commit adultery. Don't murder. That sort of thing. And these things are sort of presented as the core commandments for God's people, for the Israelites. And lest we forget, those Ten Commandments are followed by another 603 down the road. But those are sort of the core, the things from which all the other commandments in the Old Testament come from. And it's been said that the Ten Commandments can be shortened down to this: put God first, put your family second, and put your property third. Easy enough, rather than remembering 613 commandments, right? So the rest of Exodus is broken up in these Sinai commandments. And so you got the Ten Commandments, and then there's a little section about building altars, how to worship God, just a brief interlude there. Then what's called the covenant code, which has to do with property, restitution, violence, and slavery. And then finally, the last few chapters are uh, have to do with that should be 25 to 40, the worship of God with one another, and we get these little narrative interludes about how they're going about this, and Aaron is sort of Moses's right hand man, and then there's this golden calf episode, covenant made, covenant broken, already very early on. And it's so easy to get lost in sort of the doldrums of these laws, because let's face it, it's boring reading, right? It's okay to admit that and say that it's boring reading. Just a couple things I want to throw out there, point out to draw your attention to. So this is a world, keep in mind, where there is not international law. It's there's these little nation states in places, and there's these tribes, and everybody's at each other all the time. It is a violent world. Retribution is common, and there is lawlessness, frankly, because the law is different in one place to another. There's not this sort of code that everybody goes by. And God's law, as harsh as it seems in places, actually looks a lot different than what the rest of the world's doing. Look at a couple of little verses here. 21:16. If you kidnap someone in order to sell them into slavery, capital punishment for you. Kidnapping somebody to sell them into slavery was a common practice, but God says, no, can't do that. Here's another one, 21:20. If you kill a slave, capital punishment. You can't be nice to slaves. And then there's the next verse says, but if you hurt a slave and then it takes him a few days to die, that's okay. So it's a little, not really sure what to think of that, right? Then in chapter 22 is all about the laws of restitution. If you, which we carry on to this day in the United States to a certain degree, if you cause $100 of damage to somebody's property, you need to pay them $100. And these laws of restitution being laid out very specifically sort of stop this cycle of retribution, right? You hurt me, then I hurt you, then you hurt me, then I hurt you, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It stops this idea of unlimited vengeance. And then we ask, well, these seem so harsh, right? There's all these laws about who gets put to death, and you got to do this, and you got to do that. And you might step back and say, okay, let's just imagine where they're at. The Israelites have been enslaved for generations upon generations upon generations. They're off wandering. They don't have really any experience to live for themselves, and they live in this. They're a tiny little group in this violent world. They have no money, no property, nothing except God on their side. Is there a bit of, you might ask, is there a bit of a realistic worldview in Exodus here? It's not idealistic yet, right? It's not everybody's going to get along and we'll be happy. But it's realistic in that oppression and violence will come, and the question is not will they come, but how will God's people respond to these things? So that at some point, God's bigger picture is that the idealistic vision of Revelation 21 might one day come to be. Remember, it says this is right at the end of the Bible. God Himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. So, a couple other little bits of grace sprinkled in there that you might miss. There's this little brief section on building an altar. It's where you worship God. This is not the altars of the day to the various gods were up in high places and golden and made with silver. It's really ornate and fancy. And the altar that they are to make when they want to worship God is an altar out of earth. It's something you build from the dust of the ground. Remember, Adam and Eve came from the dust of the ground. The altar is something you build from the dust of the ground. It's low and it's simple and it's handicap accessible and accessible to children. God can be worshipped by anybody. Here's another one, 21:13. If you accidentally kill somebody, they're going to be after you, and God is going to give you a place to flee. Little bits of grace sprinkled in there. And so this whole second half of Exodus is really about okay, so these people have escaped. God's people have escaped. Now, what kind of community is God making? What kind of community is God forming? Who will they be? Nathan Bills said, Exodus is just as much about an entrance as it is an exit. So, of course, we remember the exit from Egypt as kind of the big thing in Exodus. That's the word Exodus means exit, right? And it is about that, but it's also then about the entrance into God's community, into God's presence, into this new way of life. Then Christopher Wright said, God is not, in similar fashion, God is not merely intent on liberating slaves, but on reclaiming worshipers. So not just let my people go, they're out of here, but bringing them back to God. Remember, it said that they had forgotten about God. They'd been enslaved for so long, they'd forgotten about the God of their ancestors. And so God is bringing them back.